Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Maria Tomás-Keegan, and I want to welcome you to the show where we share a little bit of wit, a little bit of wisdom, and some wonderful guests who help our women navigate career and life changes and challenges. And most importantly, to let you know that you're not alone. Each week through these conversations, we share resources to encourage women to feel more confident, resilient, and brave in their career and life choices. So we stream live every week on Thursdays at 10 a.m. Pacific time on the E360 TV network, which you can find on all your favorite streaming platforms. And we go live simultaneously on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, where you can interact with us. And if you love to listen to your favorite shows, you can also find us on all the podcast channels. So if something inspires you today and you want more, please subscribe to your favorite channel, leave us a comment, and share your favorite episodes so we can create more ripples in the world for women. Now, we have a returning guest with us today, and I'm very excited about this. However, we're talking about a subject that is one of her areas of expertise, and we both wish we didn't have to talk about this anymore. But it is a prevalent concern for many of the professional women I meet and work with, and it's toxic work environments. Now, Julia Toothacre is a renowned career coach and strategist, recognized as the #2 career coach by Career Addicts in 2023. Julia brings to our show over a decade of experience in career development, teaching, and coaching. As the founder of Ride the Tide Collective and host of the Control Your Career podcast, she's become a sought-after thought leader in guiding ambitious professionals to align their careers with their personalities and their values. And today we're going to talk about how subtle toxic environments can be, how to recognize the signs, why people stay, and when they should leave. So thanks so much, Julia, for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me back, Maria. I'm happy to be here to talk to you, but I'm not really happy to have to talk about this subject again.
I know that feeling really, really well. I wish we didn't have to talk about it, but it is in a lot of people's lives. So when we talk about it and we make kind of advance the conversation about this, heighten people's awareness, and give them some tips about what to do about it, I think that makes for time well spent for us on this show.
I think so too.
All right, so let's start with what you mean by subtle toxic environments.
Yeah. So when we were talking about what to talk about for this episode, we didn't want to reprise what we had already talked about. And I think, toxic work environments get talked about a lot, and the big things get talked about a lot in terms of verbal abuse and things like that. And so I wanted to take a different approach and talk about the subtle toxic environments and the subtle things that can happen that sometimes we don't recognize right off the bat. They are things that can happen repeatedly, but they happen so far apart that you just don't recognize that it's happening, or maybe it's not happening to you. And these are minor incidents that happen. So it can be something that somebody says, it can be a behavior, it can be just an action, but it's very subtle. It's very subtle. So we don't always know that it's happening to us or to somebody else. Sometimes it might take us a little bit of time to reflect and go, wait, I don't think that was actually a very nice thing that they said, or they really slighted that person over there. I don't think that was very nice. Sometimes we don't catch those things in the moment, but what ends up happening is if those things build on each other and it builds and it builds and it builds, then all of the sudden you're in a toxic environment. And it can be hard to recognize because it's all these little micro things that are happening. And so sometimes it makes you even second guess yourself as to whether or not it's a toxic environment.
I love what you said about that. It's not until we reflect back on what just happened, what was said, how someone was treated, that we might stop to realize that that wasn't very nice,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is not a one-time deal,
Mm-mm.
that it happens repeatedly. And very often it's the same people who repeat that behavior with different people. And because it's with different people, we may not see it or kind of connect the dots there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
And then when it happens to us, that sometimes is the signal, right?
Right. Right. Well, and I've been in situations where something has been said to me, and in the moment, I couldn't even process what was happening because it was partial shock and partial just, I don't know how to handle this particular situation. Right. And you sit
Can you
back
be
and
more specific about that so people maybe will
yeah.
connect with the situation?
Yeah. So I was in a situation where I had a supervisor. I hope I can get the wording right, but it might be slightly off. I had a supervisor who basically made a comment about my weight without making a comment about my weight. And so I had talked about how my position and what had been going on in the team, like everybody was really stressed and all of that. And in an what appeared to be an offhand comment, she said, weight gain is a sign of high stress. And it was myself and another coworker. We were together, and I just sat there and I was like, did she just tell me I'm fat? Because I'm pretty sure that's what she just said.
Yeah.
But that's not what she said. And that was the first of a few comments that had been made around my size. And
Right.
for reference, because obviously, we're on video, I'm almost 6 feet tall. So I'm never going to be a small person, just
Right.
in general. But even back then, I wasn't, a huge person, but I can't change my height. And so it was almost this like slight to the fact that I'm so much taller. I'm a woman, and there were comments made about how I dressed and all these different things. And I was like,
Yeah.
what is happening right now? And nobody
Yeah.
had ever made a comment like that to me before in this particular environment. I was one of the most professionally dressed. I never got comments like that until this particular person came in and started
Wow.
managing
Yeah.
us,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And figuring out and if so figuring out how to handle them in a way that doesn't lower you to their standard, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I talk about this so much with my clients. We have to teach people how to treat us.
Mhm.
And when something like that happens, when it is when we finally figure it out, because it's so subtle, right? And you could have interpreted what she said, instead of being about your weight, being about you being stressed, right?
Absolutely.
Her recognizing that this is a stressful situation and it's affecting us.
Mhm.
So it's all how you take it too,
Right.
right? How we
Right.
interpret things,
Right.
how we perceive things.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I talk about that with my clients too, right? And I call it realistic reality. What actually happened, what was actually said. And I think for my context, and this is why I think documentation and then understanding the situation is really important. Saying that one comment, I think, could have been taken either way, right?
Yeah.
But when you back it on multiple comments
Yeah.
that had to do with my appearance, that had to do with my size specifically, and things that I didn't really have control over at that time, that's when it became a toxic thing to me. And I think that's the difference between the realistic reality of could you have misinterpreted a situation and the realistic reality of no, that's toxic behavior when you're stringing all of these things together
when
and
it
you're
happens
seeing the
more than
pattern.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you recognize that you're in an environment like this, so did you say she was your supervisor?
She was, yes.
So you're reporting into this person. So what do you do about that?
Well, I was in a situation that I think a lot of people are in right now, in that she was a new supervisor and we were afraid for our jobs at that point. And so because of that, I really didn't want to rock the boat, even though, this is the irony of that, even though I knew at that time that I was likely not going to get fired. Just because I knew I had support in different areas and things like that. But still, that's still my supervisor. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to cause concern. At that point, I had not looked for another job in a while. I didn't have feelers out. Like, I was not prepared if something happened to me. And so I took things more than I should have or wanted to, because one, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't creating a situation that wasn't there, because we were all heightened, emotions and things like that with different things that had happened. And I wanted to make sure that essentially I had a good case if I needed to bring it to HR in terms of behavior. And so I started documenting those interactions.
So when you talk about documenting the interactions, are you talking about recording? Are you talking about making notations in your own file? How did you document?
Yeah, for me, it was, I had a notebook that I kept. So an actual physical notebook, not on the computer, because the company owns the computer. But I had a physical notebook where I kept documentation of interactions that we had. So I would write the date, the time, who was there, if it was, somebody other than myself. And I would give like an overview of what happened. Because what I had learned previously as well was if you're going to have a claim against somebody, especially if it's something like that can be considered harassment, then you have to have documentation. There has to be essentially a log of these things. It can't just be one offhand thing that has happened. There has to be some kind of documentation of multiple things happening.
Of the pattern. Of the pattern.
Right.
Do you ever, you mentioned that somebody else might have been a witness to it. Do you ever reach out to them and ask them, what did you hear?
At that time, I don't think that I did. And I think that was I'm like reflecting back on that time, it was such an emotionally heightened time that while that was said to me, that wasn't even the worst thing that happened that day.
Oh dear.
So, when you're trying to put things into perspective, at that time, the role that I played and the role that I was trying to play was trying to be supportive to the team as a whole. So even if something was happening to me, I'm like, all right, I can manage that, but we have to manage what's happening to the team.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to protect that. I think more so than I was trying to protect myself.
Oh, noble.
I know.
Let's talk about let's talk about whether that's a good idea to reach out to others who may have witnessed what you consider toxic behavior, what any one of us consider toxic behavior, and we're keeping a log. We are, in this day and age of, videos on everyone's phone. I suppose it could be recorded. Um, but I was just wondering if someone else is a witness to it. What do you think? Is it wise to reach out to them and just ask them, what did you hear? How did you interpret that situation?
I think so. I think especially if it's somebody if it's a coworker, team member, I absolutely actually, even if it's not, even if it's somebody who maybe is not part of the team and is a little more impartial, I would,
Yeah.
because I think sometimes having the opinion of somebody else that was in the room, again, gets us back to that realistic reality. Am I overreacting on this? Did I read this wrong? Because especially in my situation, we were already heightened, right? There were already a lot of emotions. So I had to really figure out, am I bringing an extra layer to this because I'm
Mm.
already frustrated?
Hmm.
So am I reading into things the
Right.
wrong way?
Is
You
it
know?
being colored by all this other stuff that's going on, and we're kind of blowing it out of proportion?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I will say though, I think most of the time we're not.
I'm so glad you said that, because just as those words came out of my mouth, I wanted to take them back, but no, I wanted to clarify that I, I believe if we feel that we are being targeted in some way with toxic behavior,
Hmm.
that it's probably true in one way, shape, or form.
Hmm. Yes.
So I don't want people to think that they should second guess themselves.
Right.
But I do think that if there is a witness to it, having that kind of corroboration might be very helpful for
Hmm.
us to see, are we seeing it clearly for what it is, or are we misinterpreting?
And this is also where the documentation helps,
Yeah,
because it forces you to relive that experience and write things down as it happened. And then you get to start to feel like, am I processing emotions or am I processing facts?
good
So
point.
that's where documentation, I think, is so helpful, learning how to
Yeah.
do that well.
Yeah, writing down what happened, and making it, trying to make sense of, because typically we don't write at the height of emotion,
Mm-mm.
right? While we're in the
Mhm.
throes of it, we'll do it
Right.
later, and our we could calm down a little bit and maybe think through it a bit more rationally and record it that way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, what can people do to recognize the signs of this subtle toxicity in our work environments?
Yeah. So I want to back up a little bit, because
Sure.
I one of the things that I think we need to identify a little bit more clearly is what could be considered those subtle toxic moments, right?
Sure.
And
Great.
so in the example that I gave, I would say that is, borderline harassment. I don't know that it was intended that way, but that's how it felt at the time. Gaslighting is something that I think happens a lot, and people don't realize that it's not a new term, but it's a term that people are still learning right now. And so that is essentially when someone makes you doubt or question what really happened. And they do that sometimes by giving you a slightly altered version of what happened, or they slip in a couple, false things that happened to make you essentially feel like you're crazy. So that can happen a lot if we're in like a he said, she said situation. Um, Microaggressions, I would say, are probably one of the biggest subtle things that happen. And a lot of people don't pick up on them unless they're directed at you, unfortunately. And so I think understanding what microaggressions can sound like, what they can look like, I think is very helpful for people. Because what I think happens is a lot of times we just don't know that it's even happening because we don't have the language to identify that it's happening. So gaslighting, microaggressions, I would say gossip falls under this as well. We always talk about gossip and how you should not be gossiping or anything like that, but it still happens. And usually you can pinpoint it to a couple of people on your team, in your office, that are really the ones that spearhead that. And that can create a toxic environment just by having to be around somebody that's constantly speaking negatively about other people. And then the other thing too is if there's inappropriate sharing of information, and I think this can go coworker to coworker, manager to coworker, manager to manager. I think this can happen at any level, but there are a lot of things that we shouldn't be sharing about other coworkers, about management, about situations. And sometimes people just feel like they need to get it off their chest, or they're sharing it for whatever reason that's usually not okay. And those little incidences, if you have enough of them, it adds up to you getting this feeling of something doesn't feel right in this position, right?
Right.
I like my job. I like my work. I'm paid well. Everything else might be great, but something's just off.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about recognizing the signs, a lot of times that's where it starts, is especially as women, we just have this gut feeling something is not right. And what's not right? And it's likely that a lot of these little subtle things have been happening and they're just building up, right? But if you're not actively recognizing them and seeing it and seeing what's happening, then it kind of sneaks up on you. And then you almost get blindsided sometimes, I think, because then, maybe it's happening to you. Maybe it was happening around you before, but now it's happening to you and you had no idea. And so now you go from an environment that was pretty good and everything was all right. And now you're like, I got to get out of here because it just doesn't feel safe anymore.
Right.
Now we don't have a psychologically safe environment.
That is such a key sign that something's not right when you don't feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you're so right that these subtle signals of, and thank you for reviewing what they could be, the gossip, the microaggressions, the gaslighting, any one, or in some cases all of them, can be piling up from multiple sources, in fact, because in an environment where this behavior is allowed, and like I said before, we teach other people how to treat us.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is doing the gaslighting, is doing the gossiping, other people are participating. You can't have a gossip without someone else listening to it and potentially participating in it. So now you have this chain of gossips.
Right.
And that creates an atmosphere that doesn't feel safe. So other people are participating because they see the behavior happening and it's not being dealt with. So it's interpreted as being allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely not a safe place to be. And I know a lot of women who have described situations like this to me recently who are so, excuse my language, pissed off that they have to consider changing jobs to get out of it when they love what they do. They love the work they do. They just don't love where they do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a situation that it feels like I'm being forced out.
Right.
Never a good feeling.
And that's hard to track too. Again, because
Yeah.
it's one thing if somebody is just openly terrible to you, in front of a group of people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now we've got witnesses, it's obvious, and it's like, yes, I can pinpoint that was the moment that I knew this wasn't going to be a good thing. But that's not what we're talking about here.
No.
And that's what makes it, I think, especially for women, because I think that we can justify so much in terms of other people's behavior and all of that. Like, oh, maybe they're having an off day. Maybe something's going on. Maybe this, maybe that. Well, it wasn't a big deal. It was just
Right.
this little thing. I'm sure they didn't mean it like that. Like, how often do we do that
Yeah.
for other people because we just don't want to have to deal with whatever is actually happening?
Well, I'm not sure. That may be part of it, but I'm not sure that by nature, most women give people the benefit of the doubt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that puts us in a vulnerable situation where we continue to allow it to happen
Mm-hmm.
because we aren't teaching other people how to treat us,
Right.
right? We're not setting boundaries. We're tolerating stuff that is not acceptable behavior because we're giving them the benefit of the doubt. So at some point in time, we have to draw the line
Mm-hmm.
and say, okay, guys, enough is enough. I've tolerated this long enough. This is not how I deserve to be treated. And I'm going to insist that this change or something else is going to happen. I don't know what that is yet, but
Right.
something else is going to happen. So I'm documenting all of this. I'm reporting it to HR. I'm going to make a big deal of it if you don't back off,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it means we have to advocate for ourselves, don't we?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But also, I think this is also a space for us to advocate for others.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if we have people who are in marginalized groups, right, who work on our teams, and we see those microaggressions happening and we know what that looks like and what that sounds like. I think that's a space for us to be advocates for other people on the team as well, to help support them in spaces where they might not feel safe either. So I think it goes both ways. We got to advocate for ourselves, but I
Sure.
think we have to advocate for those around us who need it as well.
When we see it happening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that for a minute. What does that look like? What does advocating for others look like? We in a subtle when what we're talking about here are all those subtle things that can happen that can sneak up on us and pile up on us, and we notice that it's happening to others. What does that look like to advocate for them?
I
What are the actions that we can take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the situation, obviously, and how it's happening. But I think calling out behavior the second that it happens is probably one of the better things that you can do if it's appropriate for the situation.
Right?
Right. So it's not always appropriate to do that. If you're in a big meeting, it might not be the best idea to,
At the
like,
moment,
at the moment, call
right?
somebody out. Um, but I think also alongside that, reading the situation, but talking to whoever that person was that said the thing afterwards to say,
Right.
hey, that was not an appropriate thing to say. I don't know if you realized. And I think some of this is in how you phrase things, right? Because
Mhm.
people always will feel attacked, unfortunately. But I think some people don't even realize how they sound.
Right.
They don't understand because it's been possibly part of their vernacular for a long time. And so like you said earlier, until somebody calls it out, you
Right.
know, it's going to keep happening. And so I think if you have a relationship with somebody that said something, then I think absolutely go and say something to them. If not, I think it's a conversation you could even have with a manager to say, hey, I was in a meeting, I witnessed this, but I recognize that I don't have a relationship with this person. Maybe it's another manager or a leader, and your manager might have, more influence to be able to go and have that conversation. Because the problem is the next thing that's going to happen is going to be HR report.
Well, that's right. But at some point, we have to figure out, how do we stop the behavior? So if we can do all that we can do to keep it, kind of private, right? Have these one-on-one conversations with the culprit, right? The person who is behaving this way, and call them out privately first, and then and you're so right. It's all how we approach it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you said is a great way to start with. I'm not sure you realize how you sounded in there, or that what you said was so obviously hurtful to so-and-so. Did you recognize that? And when the person reacts to that, it's like, oh no, I didn't, or yeah, I intended it.
Right.
Then you know what to do next, right?
Right. And some of this comes down to also you understanding your influence in the room, right? Versus somebody else's influence in the room. Because I know a lot of people who will stand up for themselves. They don't need an advocate. They will call somebody out,
right?
100%, because they know that they have the influence in the room to do it. So some of this is, I think, understanding where you are professionally in your organization, right? Like, are you somebody that people are going to listen to, or are they going to dismiss you? And I hate that that is a conversation that we have to have.
I know.
But I've been in environments where I've been in certain rooms where if I had said something, everybody would have just stared at me and then turned back and had a different conversation.
Yeah.
And I've been in other rooms where they would have looked at me and we would have gotten into it right there, and it would have been fine because they respected where I was at. So it's a lot of really reading the room, reading the situation, understanding what can be done, and maybe who is the best person to have that conversation. And sometimes it's HR. Sometimes it's straight to HR to say, hey, this happened in this meeting. I don't know how to handle it. What do you suggest that I do? Because maybe this isn't the first time that it's happened.
Right.
But maybe you're listening to this and you're like, oh, this has happened to me before and I don't know how to handle it. Go to HR, go to HR and they'll help you work through different scenarios of how to manage it.
Yeah. So that the role that they can play in this is kind of an objective arbiter of the situation, right? And they can ask you questions that you might not have thought about asking yourself. About the situation, about what happened, about how often it's happened. And then you start to reflect, like we talked about earlier, and you see how subtly these what seemingly small incidents have actually piled up into a situation where you feel judged, you don't feel safe, or whatever that is, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about how we can manage situations like this.
Yeah. So
this is a tough one.
I know this is such a tough one. And
it's situational too, right?
It's absolutely situational.
It's hard to have a more generic conversation about this, but let's try, because I know people are going to want to hear what you think about, so how do we manage this? I don't want to leave my job. How do I manage it?
Yeah. So I think some of it we've already talked about. Some of it is realizing, are these incidents really issues, or is it something that's been misinterpreted? That's the first thing. We have to make sure that the incident is, I don't want to say worth, putting time into, but that's kind of what it is. You have to make sure that it's actually happening. Aside from that, it's also what I just said. It's being confident enough to say, hey, I'm not okay with this, right? It's speaking up for yourself. And you said it earlier, Maria, it's learning how to set boundaries for yourself. And so if we think about like the gossiping coworker, I feel like that's the most common one that people can relate to. It's okay if you have somebody who is constantly trying to get you into the gossip, it's okay to say, hey, I don't really want to have this conversation. I'm not really interested in talking about other people when they're not present. It's okay to have those boundaries with your coworkers. And I'm going to tell you, it is uncomfortable. Everything we're talking about today is an uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to have it. Nobody wants to be the person to have to say it. But if we don't, then it continues. And like you said, then we get into a situation where we feel like we have to leave.
Right.
Because we're not comfortable anymore and we're not safe anymore. So I think some of this is you as an employee, you have to understand your boundaries, your limits. You need to respect your coworkers' boundaries and limits, right? I know a lot of people who really don't like to share about their personal life at work. Respect that. Don't take it out on them. Don't make them seem outside of the group because they're not willing to share more about themselves. That's a boundary that they have, right? And if you keep pushing, then that becomes a very harassing feeling.
Right.
And again, it's so small and people will say, oh, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Yeah, but if it's happening all the time and it's happening to you, then that becomes very hard to manage. So I think it's understanding your boundaries, respecting other people's boundaries, not being afraid to call out behavior when you hear it, when you see it. And I think too, being very aware during one-on-one conversations with people, because I think that this is where it happens more often than not. So it happens in a conversation. Maybe you're having a conversation, could be with a manager, but could be a coworker. And the other person says something about somebody else. Or they make an offhand comment, quote unquote, that's really a microaggression, right? Or something like that. I think when you're in that one-on-one space, that's the space for you to say, is that really what you meant to say? Or, I'm sorry, can you clarify what you mean by that? Because some of what you have to do, and you mentioned this earlier, is getting that other person to realize that what they said was not okay.
Right.
And so asking some of those clarifying questions in a one-on-one space, if you hear it, but you also have to be primed to hear it, which is a whole other skill set. So some people, I think, are very primed to hear gaslighting, to hear microaggressions, because either it's happened to them, or they've just been trained to hear it. So like I've been trained to hear it, and so I can hear it in a conversation, but not everybody has that awareness. And so I hope that whoever's listening today, they're like, oh, maybe I need to read up on some of this to have a little extra knowledge so that I know if it's happening to me or to somebody else.
And to be able to put the language around it so that if you are recording what's going on for you or in the workplace for someone else or to someone else, you have the language. If you read up on, so what does it sound like when someone's gaslighting? What does it sound like when someone is behaving through microaggression, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening? What does it sound like when people are, are gossiping versus just telling stories, right?
Yep.
That are in no way evidence of a toxic environment. They're just telling stories,
Right.
right?
Right.
How do you tell the difference? So, yeah, learning more about what it is. If you feel like you're in one of these subtle workplace environments, then having the language to express what's going on would be very helpful for you to be able to recognize the signs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Be able to address them, right? Potentially directly advocating for yourself or someone else, or take it to HR and know how to express it
Mm-hmm.
so that they understand the severity of it.
Absolutely. I will say we've been talking about HR. If you're in a larger organization that does harassment training
Mm-hmm.
online and all of that, I know the last one that I did for an organization that I work for, they do all of this. So the examples that they gave through this harassment training mirrors a lot of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So when you have to do that harassment training and you're like, oh man, harassment training is so boring, blah, 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 that's where you learn it. That's where you learn how to recognize some of these things that you say that are not appropriate,
Right.
and these subtle toxic things that we do that we don't even realize sometimes.
Yeah.
So pay attention during the harassment training.
Yeah, pay attention, pay attention. So, really quickly, let's talk about when people should consider moving on. What's that point of no return? What does that look like?
I would say it's when you become the target. When you become the target and and you feel like there's not much you can do about it, HR can only do so much and will only do so much, and if you're in a situation where your coworkers are coming at you and a manager's coming at you, and that happens, unfortunately,
Yeah. It happened to
or
you.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it happens. Or if you really do not feel safe
Yeah.
in the environment. And that might not take a lot, depending on who you are and your makeup, your personality, what you've been through in life. It might not take a lot for you to go, I can't be in this environment, and then
Right.
start trying to find a way out, start looking for a new position. But for things like this, I will say, I think it's always better to try to manage these first because they are minor. I think that if we talk about giving people the benefit of the doubt, if we have those conversations and all of that, we understand ourselves and what is true and all of that, I think it can be managed unless it continues to happen. We always have those
Right.
toxic people where it won't stop, and that's a different
Because
situation.
that's who they are.
Right.
And if there's nothing that the organization will do about that, then you need to remove yourself from that environment. And that doesn't mean necessarily leaving the company,
Very true.
right? So unless the whole company tolerates this behavior, but more often than not, it's like a small group within the organization that
Mm-hmm.
is just, unaware or just tolerate
Right.
bad behavior.
Right. Yeah.
And it
Teams are
generally
different.
starts at the top, right? And
Yeah.
right,
Absolutely. Teams are different. You might be
right.
on one team and it's terrible. You might move to another team and it's the greatest situation you've ever been in.
Right, right. So exploring your options within the organization you're in, if
Mm-hmm.
that feels right to you,
Mm-hmm.
if it feels like this is just an isolated segment of the organization that treats people like this, then that's obviously the first thing to do so that it's not as much of a disruption in your career and your life. But then there's always the possibility that it is an organization-wide allowance of bad behavior.
Yes.
And then there's no choice.
Then just get out.
Just get out.
Yeah.
Remove yourself from it as quickly as you can, and as quickly as your circumstances allow, right?
Yes, I wouldn't quit without something else lined up unless you have the financial means to do so.
Right. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, Julia, I'm so glad you came back. I'm going to say it again. I'm really sorry we have to have these conversations, but I love where you took this one that there are so many subtle behaviors that we may not even recognize. And you said something earlier, you'll bring it up to somebody and they'll go, "Oh, I was just kidding." Well, if they're just kidding too many times, then it's okay for you to say, "Please don't kid that way with me anymore.
Absolutely.
That's not acceptable to me." And who cares what they think about you for having said that? Stand up for yourself, advocate for yourself, and teach people how to treat you.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So let's wrap this up. I know you have lots of key takeaways to come from this segment. So give us like your last hurrah here on the subject.
So I'm going to go back to basics on this because I think that that's where so many people likely are at when it comes to this particular topic. Because I'm sure some of you are listening to this and going, "Oh no, I think I might be in this situation. I think this has been happening to me." Really go back and understand what the subtle toxic behavior looks like. Gaslighting, microaggressions, gossip, inappropriate sharing of information, general discrimination, right? Ageism, age things happen so much. Gender comments, racial comments, all of that. Be familiar with what that looks like and sounds like. There's so much information online. I'm sure your human resources has information as well, but educate yourself so that you can hear it and you understand when it's happening, and you can not only advocate for yourself, but you can help advocate for others.
That's such good advice. Such good advice. Thank you, Julia.
You're welcome.
I appreciate your being here, taking the time out. I know you're a little bit under the weather, but I'm so glad that you made it here today to share with our audience. So I know that there are going to be people who watch this who are going to go, "I need to talk to that Julia gal." What is the one best way for people to reach out to you, to connect with you?
Yeah, they can head over to my website, which is ridethetidecollective.com. That has all my contact information. It has a bunch of career resources that are helpful. My podcast is linked over there, coaching options, my LinkedIn. That's really the hub to be able to get connected with me and to just learn more about what I do as a career coach.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for what you do, for all the people you help. I really appreciate that you are in their lives, that everyone needs help at some point in their time, in their careers. And you and I have a passion for doing that. So thanks for being in my community.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back, Maria. This was such a great conversation. Again, don't want to have it, but I'm glad that I got to have it with you.
I know. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for those who are watching and listening. I really appreciate that you are a part of this community as well. So if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, click a star. Let us know what you think. Creating and sharing resources for women is one of my very favorite things to do. And another favorite thing is being a career and life coach for women navigating challenging times and helping them get unstuck out of their rut. So if something in the episode resonates with you and you'd like a fresh perspective, reach out. Let's have a chat. The links to connect with me and Julia are in the show notes below. And let's meet again here next Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific time for another inspiring conversation. Because you know what? I believe it's our time to thrive. So let's thrive together. Until next time, I'm Maria Tomás-Keegan, helping you turn transition into triumph.